Welcome to medieval France, circa 1400. Picture this: the sun rises over a landscape dotted with stone castles, thatched roof villages, and endless fields where peasants toil under the watchful eyes of their lords. This is a world where the clang of a blacksmith's hammer mingles with the chanting of monks, where magnificent cathedrals tower over humble cottages, and where life and death dance together in an intricate ballet of survival, faith, and feudal obligation. The year 1400 places us squarely in the late Middle Ages, a time of profound transformation in French society. The devastating Black Death had swept through Europe just 50 years earlier, killing perhaps one-third of France's population and fundamentally altering the social and economic fabric of the nation. The Hundred Years' War with England was in full swing, bringing both glory and devastation to French soil. Yet amid this turmoil, French culture was beginning to flower in ways that would lay the groundwork for the Renaissance. France in 1400 was not the unified nation we know today, but rather a patchwork of duchies, counties, and royal domains, each with its own customs, dialects, and loyalties. The French king, Charles VI, ruled from Paris, but his authority was challenged by powerful nobles who controlled vast territories and maintained their own armies. This was a feudal society in transition, where ancient traditions clashed with emerging ideas about governance, religion, and human nature. To understand life in 1400 France, we must immerse ourselves in a world where social hierarchy was not just accepted but considered divinely ordained. From the lowliest serf tied to the land to the most powerful duke commanding thousands of knights, everyone knew their place in what medieval thinkers called the Great Chain of Being. Yet within this rigid structure, human drama unfolded in all its complexity: love and betrayal, ambition and resignation, innovation and tradition. In this exploration, we'll walk through the narrow, muddy streets of medieval towns, peer into the smoky interiors of peasant hovels, climb the spiral staircases of noble castles, and kneel in the hushed sanctity of Gothic cathedrals. We'll witness the daily struggles of ordinary people trying to make a living, raise their children, and find meaning in a world that could be both beautiful and brutal. We'll see how they ate, how they worked, how they loved, how they prayed, and how they faced the constant specter of disease, warfare, and death. The France of 1400 was a land of contrasts. While peasants subsisted on dark bread and thin gruel, nobles feasted on elaborate banquets featuring multiple courses of meat, fish, and exotic spices. While common folk lived in one- or two-room houses with dirt floors and no chimneys, aristocrats inhabited sprawling castles with dozens of rooms, magnificent tapestries, and private chapels. While most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, merchants, pilgrims, and knights journeyed across continents, bringing back tales of distant lands and strange customs. Yet for all these differences, certain experiences united people across social boundaries. Everyone lived under the shadow of the Catholic Church, which provided not just spiritual guidance but also the primary framework for understanding the world. Everyone feared the outbreak of plague, the failure of crops, or the arrival of enemy armies. Everyone participated, in their own way, in the seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life: the planting and harvesting of crops, the celebration of religious festivals, the marking of births, marriages, and deaths. This was also a time of remarkable creativity and innovation. Gothic architecture reached new heights of sophistication, creating spaces that seemed to lift the human spirit toward heaven. Manuscript illumination flourished, producing works of art that combined religious devotion with acute observation of the natural world. Literature was beginning to be written in French rather than Latin, making stories and ideas accessible to a broader audience. Universities were expanding, fostering new ways of thinking about philosophy, theology, and natural science. As we embark on this journey through 1400 France, we'll discover that medieval people were not the ignorant, superstitious peasants of popular imagination, but rather complex individuals navigating a sophisticated society with its own logic, values, and achievements. They loved and grieved, hoped and feared, created and destroyed, just as people do today. Their world may seem foreign to us, but their humanity remains startlingly familiar. The social hierarchy: understanding medieval French society. Medieval French society in 1400 was built upon a fundamental principle: the three orders. This concept, which had dominated European thinking since the early Middle Ages, divided all of society into three distinct groups, each with its own sacred duty. The orators, or those who pray, comprised the clergy and were responsible for the spiritual welfare of society. The bellictores, or those who fight, included the nobility and knights whose duty was to protect the realm through warfare. Finally, the laborators, or those who work, encompassed everyone else, the vast majority of the population who produced the food and goods necessary for society's survival. This tripartite division was not merely a convenient way of organizing society, it was considered a divine mandate. Medieval thinkers believed that God had ordained this system, and to rebel against one's assigned place was tantamount to rebellion against the sea. At the apex of secular society stood the king, believed to rule by divine right and serving as God's representative on earth. Charles VI, who ruled France in 1400, embodied this sacred monarchy, though his periodic bouts of madness would create a crisis that would shake the very foundations of royal authority. Below the king were the great nobles, dukes, counts, and barons who controlled vast territories and commanded the loyalty of lesser nobles in an intricate web of feudal obligations. The feudal system that governed noble society was based on personal relationships and land tenure. A duke might hold his duchy directly from the king, swearing an oath of homage and promising military service in exchange for the right to rule his territory. That same duke would then grant portions of his land to counts and barons, who would in turn subdivide their holdings among knights and lesser nobles. Each grant of land, or fief, came with specific obligations and rights, creating a pyramid of loyalty that theoretically extended from the humblest knight all the way up to the throne. However, the reality of feudal relationships was far more complex than this idealized structure suggests. Powerful nobles often held land from multiple overlords, creating conflicting loyalties that could lead to civil war. The Duke of Burgundy, for instance, held territories from both the French king and the Holy Roman Emperor, allowing him to play these great powers against each other to increase his own independence. Such complications meant that feudal loyalties were constantly being negotiated, tested, and sometimes broken. The nobility justified their privileged position through their role as warriors. From an early age, noble boys were trained in the arts of war, learning to ride war horses, wield swords and lances, and fight in the heavy armor that had become the hallmark of medieval knights. This military training was not merely practical, it was deeply cultural, involving the complex sea. Chivalry in 1400 France was a sophisticated cultural system that combined martial prowess with religious devotion and courtly refinement. A true knight was expected to be brave in battle, generous to his followers, protective of the weak, and courteous to women. He should be skilled not only in warfare but also in music, poetry, and dance. The chivalric ideal created a model of masculine nobility that influenced everything from literature to fashion to political philosophy. Noble women occupied a complex position within this hierarchy. While they were excluded from direct political power and military leadership, they could inherit and control vast estates, arrange marriages that shaped political alliances, and serve as regents for minor children. The cult of courtly love that flourished in medieval France gave women a kind of idealized authority over men's hearts, even as legal and social structures limited their practical freedom. The clergy formed a parallel hierarchy that often intersected with but remained distinct from secular authority. At the top stood the Pope in Rome, followed by archbishops, bishops, abbots, and the various ranks of priests, monks, and nuns. The church was not merely a spiritual institution but also one of the largest landowners in France, controlling perhaps 1/3 of all agricultural land and wielding enormous economic and political influence. Monastic life offered one of the few paths for social mobility in medieval society. A peasant's son who entered a monastery could rise to become an abbot, wielding authority over vast estates and hundreds of monks. Similarly, the secular clergy provided opportunities for advancement, as talented priests could gain the attention of bishops or nobles and rise through the church hierarchy. The regular clergy, monks and nuns who lived under specific religious rules, represented the spiritual elite of medieval society. The great monasteries like Cluny and Citeaux had developed elaborate liturgical practices that consumed much of the monk's day in prayer and worship. These communities were believed to serve as spiritual powerhouses, their constant prayers helping to maintain God's favor toward all of Christendom. Below the nobility and clergy lay the vast majority of the population, the laboratories who worked the land and produced the goods that sustained society. This group was far from homogeneous, including wealthy merchants who might rival nobles in their riches, skilled artisans who created beautiful and valuable objects, and poor peasants who struggled to survive on the margins of subsistence. In the towns and cities, a complex guild system governed most forms of trade and manufacture. Master craftsmen, journeymen, and apprentices formed tight-knit communities that controlled everything from bread-making to goldsmithing. These guilds served multiple functions. They maintained quality standards, controlled prices, provided for the welfare of members and their families, and organized religious celebrations and charitable activities. The guild system created its own form of social hierarchy, with successful masters accumulating wealth and influence that could rival that of minor nobles. In the great commercial cities like Paris, Rouen, and Marseille, wealthy merchants built magnificent houses, patronized artists and writers, and sometimes purchased rural estates that allowed them to live like landed gentry. Rural society was dominated by the manor system, a complex arrangement that bound peasants to the land and to their lords through a web of obligations and rights. The typical manor included the lord's castle or manor house, a village where the peasants lived, agricultural fields worked in common, forests and meadows, and often a mill and church. This system had developed over centuries and created a largely self-sufficient economic unit that could survive even when broader trade networks broke down. Peasant society itself was stratified, ranging from relatively prosperous farmers who owned their own land and livestock to landless laborers who worked for wages or food. Serfs occupied a middle position. They were bound to the land and owed specific services to their lord, but they also had rights that protected them from arbitrary treatment. A serf could not be sold separately from his land, could not have his customary holdings taken away without cause, and could usually count on his lord's protection in times of crisis. The social hierarchy of 1400 France was reinforced by countless daily rituals and practices. Clothing, for instance, was heavily regulated by sumptuary laws that specified what fabrics, colors, and ornaments each social class could wear. A peasant caught wearing silk or gold jewelry could face severe punishment, while nobles were expected to dress in a manner befitting their rank. Similarly, forms of address, seating arrangements at public gatherings, and even the right to carry certain weapons were all carefully prescribed according to social status. Yet this rigid hierarchy was not immutable. War, plague, economic change, and personal ambition constantly disrupted established patterns. The Black Death had killed so many people that surviving peasants could demand better wages and working conditions. Successful merchants could purchase noble titles or marry into aristocratic families. Bastard sons of nobles might rise to positions of great authority. The tension between social stability and social mobility would become one of the defining characteristics of late medieval society, setting the stage for the dramatic changes that would reshape France in the centuries to come. Daily life of the peasantry, survival in rural France. The vast majority of people living in 1400 France, perhaps 80 to 90% of the population, were peasants whose daily lives revolved around agricultural work and the eternal struggle for survival. To understand their world, we must set aside modern notions of comfort and convenience and enter a realm where life was precarious, work was backbreaking, and the margin between subsistence and starvation was perilously thin. The peasant's day began before dawn, not by the ringing of an alarm clock, but by the crowing of roosters and the gradual lightening of the sky. Time in medieval rural society was measured not by mechanical clocks, which were rare and found only in large towns, but by the sun, the seasons, and the rhythms of agricultural work. The canonical hours observed by monks provided some temporal structure, with church bells marking the progression from matins through vespers, but for most peasants, time was simply divided into work and rest, light and darkness. The typical peasant dwelling was a far cry from our modern conception of home. Most peasant houses were single-room structures, perhaps 20 feet square, built of local materials that varied by region. In northern France, houses might be constructed of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that dried to form reasonably sturdy walls. In areas where stone was readily available, peasant houses might feature stone foundations or even stone walls, though such construction was expensive and often beyond the means of poor farmers. The roof was typically thatched with straw, reeds, or other organic materials that provided reasonable protection from rain but required constant maintenance. A well-maintained thatch roof could last 20 years or more, but it was vulnerable to fire and provided an ideal home for insects and small animals. Some peasant houses featured wooden shingles or clay tiles, but these were luxury items that indicated a family's relative prosperity. Inside the typical peasant house, furnishings were sparse and functional. The floor was usually packed earth, perhaps covered with rushes or straw that was changed periodically. A central hearth provided heat and cooking facilities, but since most peasant houses lacked chimneys, smoke simply rose through a hole in the roof or found its way out through gaps in the walls and thatch. This meant that the interior was often smoky and dark, with soot coating the walls and rafters. The furniture consisted of a few essential pieces: a table that might be nothing more than boards laid across trestles, benches or stools for seating, a chest for storing clothes and valuables, and beds that were often simply straw pallets on the floor or raised on simple wooden frames. Wealthy peasants might own chairs, cupboards, or even a separate bedroom, but such luxuries were rare. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist in peasant households. The entire family, parents, children, and sometimes grandparents or other relatives, shared the single room, sleeping together for warmth and protection. Animals were often brought inside during winter, not only to protect them from cold and predators, but also because their body heat helped warm the house. The mingling of human and animal habitation meant that peasant houses were often dirty and smelly by modern standards, though medieval people had different concepts of cleanliness and hygiene. The peasant family's possessions were few but essential. Cooking equipment might include iron or bronze pots, wooden bowls and spoons, and perhaps a few knives. Clay vessels served for storing food and drink. Agricultural tools, plows, hoes, scythes, and flails represented major investments that were carefully maintained and passed down through generations. Most peasant families owned some livestock, a few chickens for eggs, perhaps a pig that could be slaughtered in the fall, and if they were fortunate, an ox or horse for plowing. The agricultural calendar dominated peasant life with its endless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. Spring brought the crucial task of plowing and sowing, work that often required the cooperation of multiple families since few peasants could afford their own plow team. The heavy-wheeled plows used in northern France required teams of 6 to 8 oxen, so peasants had to pool their resources and coordinate their efforts. Summer was a time of constant vigilance and labor. Crops had to be weeded, protected from birds and animals, and carefully monitored for signs of disease or drought. Hay had to be cut and stored for winter animal feed. Peasant women spent long hours tending vegetable gardens that provided essential supplements to the family diet: onions, leeks, peas, beans, and herbs that could be preserved for winter use. The harvest season, typically beginning in late July or August, was the most critical time of the peasant year. Everyone in the family, from small children to elderly grandparents, participated in the frantic race to gather the grain before it spoiled in the fields. Harvest time was both celebration and anxiety. A successful harvest meant survival through the winter, while crop failure could mean starvation. After the grain was cut with sickles or scythes, it had to be bundled into sheaves, transported to the village, and threshed to separate the grain from the stalks. Threshing was backbreaking work, typically done with flails on a hard surface like a stone courtyard. The grain then had to be winnowed to remove the chaff, a delicate process that required skill and favorable weather conditions. The peasant diet was monotonous and heavily dependent on grain. Dark bread made from wheat, rye, or barley formed the foundation of most meals, sometimes supplemented by a thin porridge or gruel. Meat was a luxury for special occasions, perhaps a chicken at Easter or portions of a pig slaughtered in the fall and preserved with salt. Fish was somewhat more common, especially during the many fast days prescribed by the church, but it too was often beyond the reach of the poorest families. Vegetables from the kitchen garden provided essential nutrition, though the variety was limited by what could be grown locally and preserved through winter. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips could be stored in root cellars. Cabbage could be fermented into sauerkraut. Beans and peas could be dried for winter use. Herbs not only flavored food but also served medicinal purposes, and peasant women accumulated considerable knowledge about which plants could treat illness or injury. Dairy products were important when available. Families that owned a cow or goats could produce milk, butter, and cheese, though fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Cheesemaking was a complex art that allowed dairy products to be preserved for months. Eggs from chickens provided protein and could be preserved in various ways for winter consumption. Peasant clothing was simple, practical, and made to last. Men typically wore a tunic that reached to the knees, covered by a cloak in cold weather, along with loose trousers or hose and leather shoes or wooden clogs. Women wore long dresses or gowns, often with an apron for protection during work, and covered their hair with veils or kerchiefs. Children wore miniature versions of adult clothing. Most peasant clothing was made of wool or linen produced locally. Sheep provided wool that peasant women spun into thread and wove into cloth on simple looms. Flax was grown and processed into linen, a laborious process that required considerable skill and patience. The wealthy might own clothing made of imported fabrics like silk, but peasant garments were uniformly brown, gray, or off-white, the natural colors of undyed wool and linen. Footwear was a particular challenge for peasants. Leather shoes were expensive and wore out quickly under the rough conditions of agricultural work. Many peasants went barefoot in summer and wore wooden clogs or primitive shoes made from animal hides in winter. The wealthy might own several pairs of shoes, but for peasants, footwear was a precious commodity that had to be carefully maintained. Social life in peasant communities centered around the agricultural calendar, religious festivals, and family celebrations. Harvest time brought communal work parties where neighbors helped each other gather crops, followed by celebrations featuring food, drink, and music. Religious holidays provided breaks from routine labor and opportunities for community gathering. Marriages, baptisms, and funerals were major social events that brought the entire village together. Entertainment was simple but meaningful. Storytelling was a crucial part of peasant culture, with tales passed down through generations around winter fire blooms. Folk songs, often linked to work activities like harvesting or spinning, helped make tedious labor more bearable. Dancing was popular at festivals and celebrations, accompanied by simple instruments like drums, pipes, and fiddles. Games provided recreation and social bonding. Adults might play dice or simple board games, while children enjoyed versions of games we still know today, hide and seek, tag, and various ball games. Seasonal activities like May Day celebrations or harvest festivals combined work with pleasure, reinforcing community bonds while accomplishing necessary tasks. The peasant family was the basic unit of production and survival. Marriage was typically arranged by families with careful consideration of economic factors, the combination of lands, livestock, and skills that would create a viable household. Love was not irrelevant, but it was generally expected to develop after marriage rather than before. Wives were expected to contribute substantially to family survival through their domestic work, agricultural labor, and child-rearing responsibilities. Children were valued both for their immediate contribution to family labor and for their role in ensuring care for aging parents. Child mortality was high, with perhaps half of all children dying before reaching adulthood, so families tended to be large to ensure that some children survived to carry on the family line. Children began working at an early age, helping with simple tasks around the farm and gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew older. Education for peasant children was minimal or non-existent. Most peasants were illiterate and saw little need for book learning in their daily lives. Knowledge was passed down orally from parent to child, how to plant crops, tend animals, preserve food, and maintain household equipment. The church provided some basic religious education, teaching peasants prayers and Bible stories, but formal schooling was reserved for the wealthy or those destined for religious life. Healthcare in peasant communities relied heavily on folk medicine and local healers, usually women who had accumulated knowledge about medicinal plants and healing practices. Professional physicians were expensive and rarely available in rural areas, so peasants had to rely on traditional remedies, prayer, and hope when illness struck. Many common ailments were treated with herbs, prayer, and time, though serious injuries or diseases often proved fatal. Death was a constant presence in peasant life. High infant mortality, periodic famines, epidemic diseases, and accidents made life precarious for everyone. Peasants developed a fatalistic acceptance of mortality that was reinforced by church teachings about the transitory nature of earthly life and the importance of preparing for eternity. Despite these hardships, peasant life was not without its joys and satisfactions. The successful completion of harvest, the birth of a healthy child, the celebration of a village festival, or simply the daily rhythm of meaningful work provided genuine fulfillment. Peasants developed deep attachments to their land, their communities, and their traditions, creating a culture that was both resilient and remarkably stable across generations. Noble life, castles, chivalry, and courtly culture. The nobility of 1400 France lived in a world of privilege and responsibility, where magnificent castles served as both symbols of power and centers of complex social, economic, and military networks. To be noble was not simply to be wealthy, though most nobles were indeed rich by medieval standards, but to occupy a specific role in society that carried with it both extraordinary privileges and demanding obligations. The castle was the physical manifestation of noble authority, a structure that combined military necessity with residential comfort and symbolic grandeur. By 1400, castle architecture had evolved far beyond the simple wooden fortifications of earlier centuries. The great stone castles that dotted the French landscape represented centuries of architectural development and enormous investments of resources and labor. A typical noble castle of this period was a complex of buildings surrounded by massive walls and defensive works. The central keep or dungeon served as the lord's residence and the castle's last line of defense. Rising several stories high, with walls that might be 10 feet thick at the base, the keep contained the great hall where the lord held court, received visitors, and dined with his household. Above the great hall were the lord's private chambers, a rare luxury in a world where privacy was scarce even for the wealthy. The great hall was the heart of castle life, a vast room that might stretch 60 feet in length and rise 30 feet to an ornate wooden roof. Here the lord displayed his wealth and power through elaborate furnishings, rich tapestries, and ceremonial objects. The walls might be decorated with weapons, banners, and hunting trophies that proclaimed the lord's martial prowess and noble lineage. At one end of the hall, a raised dais elevated the lord's table above those of his retainers, visually reinforcing the social hierarchy that governed castle life. Surrounding the keep were numerous other buildings essential to the castle's function: a chapel where daily masses were celebrated, barracks for soldiers, stables for the lord's warhorses, workshops for blacksmiths and other craftsmen, and storage buildings for food, weapons, and other supplies. The larger castles might also include gardens, courtyards for training and entertainment, and guest quarters for visiting nobles. The castle's defensive features were impressive and sophisticated. Massive gatehouse complexes protected the main entrance, featuring multiple sets of doors, heavy iron portcullises, and murder holes through which defenders could rain arrows or boiling oil on attackers. The walls themselves were marvels of engineering, designed to withstand siege engines and undermining attempts. Round towers at regular intervals allowed defenders to cover every approach with crossbow fire. Yet by 1400, many castles were evolving beyond purely military structures. The prolonged periods of peace and the increasing effectiveness of gunpowder weapons were making traditional fortifications less relevant, while the growing sophistication of noble culture demanded more comfortable and elegant living spaces. Many lords were adding larger windows, more spacious rooms, and decorative features that would have been considered vulnerabilities in earlier centuries. Life within a noble household followed elaborate patterns of ceremony and hierarchy. The lord's day began with attendance at morning mass in the castle chapel, followed by meetings with his stewards, bailiffs, and other officials who managed his estates. The administration of a great noble's lands was a complex undertaking that might involve dozens of manors, thousands of peasants, and revenues from sources as diverse as agricultural rents, tolls on roads and bridges, profits from mills and markets, and payments from vassals. The noble breakfast was typically a light meal, perhaps bread, ale, and a bit of meat or cheese. The main meal of the day was dinner, served in the great hall around midday with elaborate ceremony. The lord and his family sat at the high table on the dais, while retainers, servants, and guests were seated at long tables according to their rank in relationship to the lord. The meal itself was an impressive display of wealth and hospitality, featuring multiple courses of meat, fish, and fowl, accompanied by wines and alesh, and culminating in elaborate desserts and sweet treats. The evening meal, supper, was somewhat lighter than dinner but still formal in its service and presentation. After supper, the evening might be spent in various forms of entertainment, listening to traveling minstrels perform songs and stories, playing chess or other board games, dancing to music provided by the lord's musicians, or simply engaging in conversation with guests and household members. Noble women occupied a complex position within this hierarchical world. While they were excluded from direct political authority and military leadership, they wielded considerable influence within their own spheres. The lady of the castle was responsible for managing the domestic aspects of the household, supervising servants, overseeing food preparation and storage, managing the castle's textile production, and ensuring the comfort of guests. She also played a crucial role in the education of noble children, both her own and those of other families who might be sent to her castle as pages or ladies-in-waiting. The cult of courtly love that flourished in medieval France gave women a kind of idealized authority over men's hearts and behavior. According to the conventions of courtly love, a knight should choose a lady, often married to another man, as his inspiration and dedicate his deeds of valor to her honor. This romantic ideal influenced everything from literature to fashion to social behavior. However, the reality of noble women's lives was often quite different from these romantic ideals. They were expected to marry according to their family's political and economic interests, often to men they barely knew. Their primary duty was to produce male heirs to continue the family line, a responsibility that carried significant risks in an age of high maternal mortality. They had limited legal rights and were generally expected to defer to male authority in most matters. Yet many noble women managed to exercise considerable power despite these constraints. They could inherit and control vast estates in the absence of male heirs. They could serve as regents for minor children, governing duchies and counties with full royal authority. They could arrange marriages and alliances that shaped the political landscape for generations. Some, like Joan of Arc, even transcended gender boundaries entirely to play direct roles in military and political affairs. The education of noble children was designed to prepare them for their future roles as lords and ladies. Boys typically left their parents' household at age 7 or 8 to serve as pages in the castle of another noble family. There they learned basic manners, began their education in reading and writing, and started their training in the arts of war. At 14, a page might become a squire, serving a knight and learning the complex skills of mounted combat. The training of a knight was both physical and cultural. He had to master the use of sword, lance, and shield while wearing heavy armor and mounted on a warhorse. But he also had to learn to read and write, to play musical instruments, to compose poetry, and to conduct himself according to the elaborate code of chivalry that governed noble behavior. The ideal knight was not just a warrior but a gentleman, equally at home in the castle's great hall and on the battlefield. The ceremony of knighthood was a deeply religious and social ritual that marked a young man's passage into the warrior elite. The candidate would spend a night in prayer and fasting, often in the castle chapel, contemplating the sacred duties he was about to undertake. The next morning, he would be formally invested with his weapons and armor in a ceremony that combined Christian blessing with feudal oath-taking. The new knight would swear to protect the church, defend the weak, and serve his lord faithfully, vows that theoretically bound his behavior for the rest of his life. Noble daughters received a different but equally elaborate education. They learned to read and write, often in both Latin and French. They studied music, dancing, and the domestic arts necessary for managing a noble household. They learned the complex etiquette that governed interactions between people of different social ranks. Some received education in literature, history, and even basic accounting, skills that would serve them well if they later had to manage estates or serve as regents. Hunting was one of the primary entertainments of noble life, serving multiple purposes beyond mere recreation. It provided fresh meat for the castle's tables, kept the nobles' military skills sharp, and reinforced social hierarchies through elaborate rules about who could hunt what animals and where. The great hunts organized by powerful lords were major social events that might last for days and involve dozens of participants, hundreds of servants, and elaborate temporary camps set up in the forest. Different types of hunting carried different levels of prestige. The hunt for large game like deer, boar, and bears was reserved for the nobility and required considerable skill and courage. Falconry, the sport of hunting with trained birds of prey, was considered the most refined form of hunting, requiring years of training and considerable expense to maintain the birds and their equipment. Even the tie. Tournaments were another crucial aspect of noble culture, serving as both entertainment and military training. These elaborate events might draw nobles from across France and beyond, creating opportunities for political negotiation, marriage arrangements, and the display of wealth and power. The tournament of 1400 was a far more complex affair than the simple jousting matches often depicted in popular culture. A typical tournament might last several days and include various forms of combat. The pas d'armes, or passage of arms, involved knights defending a bridge, crossroads, or other strategic point against all comers. The melee was a general combat between two groups of knights, often representing different regions or political factions. The joust, perhaps the most famous tournament event, featured individual combat between mounted knights using blunted lances. But tournaments were more than just military exercises. There were social events that included elaborate feasts, dancing, musical performances, and religious ceremonies. They provided opportunities for unmarried nobles to meet potential spouses, for merchants to sell luxury goods, and for artists and entertainers to find wealthy patrons. The most prestigious tournaments were attended by hundreds of nobles and could cost their organizers enormous sums of money. The code of chivalry that governed noble behavior was a complex mixture of Christian ethics, military values, and romantic idealism. A true knight was expected to be brave in battle but merciful to defeated enemies, generous to his followers but modest about his own achievements, courteous to all women but especially devoted to his chosen lady. He should be skilled in arms but also cultured in music and poetry, strong in body but pure in spirit. This chivalric ideal influenced everything from architecture to literature to diplomatic protocol. Castles featured chapels and religious imagery that emphasized the Christian aspects of knighthood. Epic poems and romances celebrated knights who embodied chivalric virtues. Even the conduct of warfare was theoretically governed by chivalric principles, though the reality of medieval combat was often brutal and pragmatic. The economic foundation of noble life was the feudal system that granted lords control over vast agricultural estates worked by peasant farmers. A great lord might control dozens of manors, each producing agricultural surplus that supported his household and military retainers. But noble wealth came from many sources beyond agriculture: tolls collected from merchants using roads and bridges, profits from mills and markets, fees charged for various legal and administrative services, and tribute paid by lesser nobles in towns. Managing this complex economic system required considerable administrative skill. Great lords employed staffs of clerks, bailiffs, and stewards who kept detailed records of income and expenses, supervised the work of peasants, and ensured that the lord's rights and privileges were properly enforced. The most successful noble families were those that managed their estates efficiently while also maintaining the military and political relationships necessary for their continued power. Yet noble life was not without its challenges and constraints. The same feudal system that provided noble wealth also bound lords to their overlords through complex webs of obligation. A duke might control vast territories and command thousands of soldiers, but he also owed military service to the king and could theoretically lose his lands if he failed to meet his feudal obligations. The costs of maintaining a noble lifestyle, supporting a large household, equipping and paying soldiers, hosting elaborate entertainments, were enormous and could be. The political situation in 1400 France was particularly challenging for the nobility. The ongoing 100 Years' War with England created opportunities for military glory and advancement, but also imposed heavy financial burdens and physical dangers. The periodic madness of King Charles VI created a power vacuum that ambitious nobles sought to fill. leading to civil conflicts that would eventually explode into open warfare between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. Despite these challenges, the nobility of 1400 France maintained a culture of remarkable sophistication and creativity. Their patronage supported the construction of magnificent Gothic cathedrals, the creation of beautiful illuminated manuscripts, and the development of new forms of literature and music. Their courts served as centers of learning and artistic innovation that would influence European culture for centuries to come. Urban life, merchants, craftsmen, and guild culture. The towns and cities of 1400 France were vibrant centers of commerce, craftsmanship, and cultural innovation that stood in stark contrast to the rural world of peasants and the feudal world of nobles. Urban life offered opportunities for social mobility, economic advancement, and intellectual stimulation that were largely absent in the countryside, though it also brought new forms of danger, competition, and social tension. French cities in 1400 varied enormously in size and character. Paris, the largest city in Western Europe with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, was a cosmopolitan center of royal power, university learning, and international commerce. Major commercial centers like Rouen, Lyon, and Marseille might have populations of 20,000 to 40,000, while smaller market towns served local regions with populations of just a few thousand. Yet all urban centers shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from rural communities: concentrated populations, specialized occupations, market economies, and complex social hierarchies based on wealth and skill rather than birth and land ownership. The physical appearance of medieval French cities would seem cramped and chaotic to modern eyes. Streets were narrow, winding, and unpaved, often following ancient paths or property boundaries rather than any rational plan. Buildings were constructed primarily of wood and plaster, rising 3 or 4 stories high and projecting over the streets to maximize interior space. This created dark, tunnel-like passages at street level, where pedestrians, carts, and animals jostled for space in conditions that were often muddy, smelly, and dangerous. The typical urban house served multiple functions, reflecting the integrated nature of medieval work and family life. The ground floor might house a workshop or shop where the family's trade was conducted, with goods displayed in windows or on counters that opened directly onto the street. The family's living quarters occupied the upper floors, with the most prosperous families enjoying separate rooms for sleeping, eating, and entertaining. The wealthy might own houses with courtyards, gardens, and elaborate architectural decoration, while poorer families crowded into single rooms or cellars. Sanitation in medieval cities was a constant challenge. There were no sewage systems as we know them today, so waste was typically deposited in private latrines. Yet medieval city dwellers were not ignorant of sanitation issues. Towns passed laws requiring residents to keep their sections of street clean, hired scavengers to remove waste and dead animals, and sometimes invested in public works projects like fountains or drainage systems. The wealthiest families might have private wells, gardens, and better waste disposal systems that protected them from the worst urban conditions. Fire was another constant threat in medieval cities. The predominance of wooden buildings, open fires for heating and cooking, and industries like brewing and metalworking that required intense heat created ideal conditions for devastating blazes. Major fires could destroy entire neighborhoods, leaving thousands homeless and ruining the investments of decades. Cities responded by requiring certain buildings to be constructed of stone, organizing firefighting companies, and sometimes creating fire breaks or open spaces that could prevent the spread of flames. The guild system was the organizing principle of urban economic life, creating tight-knit communities of craftsmen and merchants who controlled most forms of trade and manufacture. Each guild represented practitioners of a specific trade: bakers, shoemakers, goldsmiths, cloth merchants, and served multiple functions within urban society. Guilds maintained quality standards for their products, controlled prices and wages, limited competition from outsiders, provided welfare support for members and their families, organized religious celebrations and charitable activities, and often wielded significant political influence within city government. The internal structure of guilds reflected a hierarchy based on skill and economic success. At the top were the master craftsmen who owned their own shops, employed other workers, and participated in guild governance. Masters had typically spent years as apprentices and journeymen, learning their trade and accumulating the capital necessary to establish independent businesses. They owned the tools and raw materials of production, controlled access to markets, and made the decisions that shaped their industry. Below the masters were the journeymen, skilled workers who had completed their apprenticeships but had not yet achieved master status. Journeymen worked for wages in the shops of masters, often moving from employer to employer as they gained experience and accumulated savings. Some journeymen eventually saved enough money to become masters themselves, purchasing the equipment and raw materials necessary to start their own businesses and paying the fees required for guild membership. At the bottom of the guild hierarchy were the apprentices, typically young men, and occasionally women, who were learning their trades under the supervision of masters. Apprenticeship contracts, usually lasting several years, bound young people to specific masters who provided training, food, shelter, and clothing in exchange for labor. The apprentice system served as a form of education, job training, and social control, ensuring that trades were properly learned and that young people were integrated into urban communities under proper supervision. The guild system created remarkable specialization in medieval cities. Paris in 1400 had over 100 different craft guilds, each controlling a specific aspect of production or trade. There were guilds for different types of metalworkers, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, armorers, and knife makers, each with their own techniques, raw materials, and markets. Textile production was divided among numerous guilds representing different stages of. This specialization created interdependence among different crafts and encouraged innovation within each field. A master craftsman who developed a new technique or design could gain significant competitive advantages, while the guild system ensured that innovations were shared among members and maintained over generations. The result was a gradual but continuous improvement in the quality and variety of manufactured goods. The daily routine of urban craftsmen varied by trade, but most followed similar patterns dictated by the availability of natural light and the rhythms of market activity. Work typically began at dawn and continued until dusk, with breaks for meals and rest. Most crafts required considerable physical skill and endurance. Metalworkers labored over hot forges, textile workers spent hours at looms or spinning wheels, and construction workers hauled heavy materials through crowded streets. The workspace of a typical craftsman was integrated with his family's living quarters, creating an environment where work and domestic life intersected constantly. Children grew up watching their parents work, learning trade skills through observation and gradually taking on simple tasks. Wives often participated directly in production, especially in trades like textile work where women's skills were particularly valued. The workshop was also a social space where neighbors, customers, and fellow craftsmen gathered to exchange news, conduct business, and maintain the relationships that sustained urban community life. Market days were crucial events in the urban calendar, bringing together producers and consumers from throughout the region. Weekly markets featured local products, fresh food, simple crafts, and everyday necessities, while annual fairs attracted merchants from across Europe with luxury goods, exotic spices, and specialized products. The great fairs of Champagne had declined by 1400, but cities like Lyon and Bordeaux still hosted international trade. The wealth generated by urban commerce supported a lifestyle that could rival or even exceed that of the rural nobility. The most successful merchants built elaborate houses decorated with rich furnishings, fine art, and imported luxuries. They wore clothing made from expensive fabrics and adorned with gold and silver jewelry. They employed servants, maintained private chapels, and sometimes owned country estates that allowed them to live like landed gentry. Wealthy urban families also invested heavily in education for their children. Unlike peasants, who saw little value in literacy, or nobles, who often preferred military training to book learning, successful merchants recognized that reading, writing, and arithmetic were essential tools for business success. Urban schools, often attached to churches or supported by guilds, provided basic education in these subjects, while the most prosperous families might hire private tutors or send their sons to universities. Women in urban society enjoyed somewhat more opportunities than their rural counterparts, though they still faced significant legal and social restrictions. Guild regulations often allowed women to work in certain trades, especially those traditionally associated with female skills like textile work, food preparation, and retail sales. Widows could sometimes inherit their husbands' businesses and continue operating them with the support of guild members. A few trades, like silk making in some cities, were dominated entirely by women. However, women's participation in urban economic life was generally limited by social expectations about appropriate female behavior and by guild regulations that favored male members. Most women worked as assistants to male craftsmen, wives, daughters, or servants who contributed essential labor but received little recognition or independent economic power. The most successful businesswomen were usually widows who had inherited established enterprises and had the social see. Urban social life was more complex and diverse than rural communities, reflecting the diversity of occupations, wealth levels, and cultural backgrounds found in cities. Religious observance remained central to urban life, but cities typically had multiple churches, each serving different neighborhoods or social groups. Craft guilds organized their own religious celebrations, often centered around patron saints associated with their trades. Wealthy families might endow private chapels or contribute to major construction projects like cathedral building. Entertainment in urban environments was more varied and sophisticated than in rural areas. Cities supported professional entertainers, musicians, actors, and storytellers who performed in public squares, taverns, and private homes. Religious dramas, performed on major feast days, drew audiences from throughout the region and combined spiritual instruction with spectacular visual effects. Secular entertainment included dancing, gambling, athletic competitions, and various forms of popular theater. Urban eating habits reflected both the greater wealth of city dwellers and the different food sources available in concentrated populations. Cities had to import most of their food from surrounding rural areas, creating complex supply networks that brought grain, meat, vegetables, and other necessities to urban markets. This dependence on imports made cities vulnerable to supply disruptions caused by warfare, bad weather, or economic problems, but it also provided access to a more varied diet than was typically available in rural areas. Wealthy urban families could afford meat several times per week, fish during religious fast periods, expensive spices to flavor their food, and wine or ale with most meals. They employed servants to prepare elaborate meals and had access to professional bakers, butchers, and other food specialists. The diet of urban workers was more limited but still generally better than that of rural peasants, featuring white bread instead of dark bread, occasional meat, and access to fresh vegetables and fruits when in season. Urban housing reflected the social stratification that characterized city life. The wealthy lived in large houses with multiple rooms, private courtyards, and elaborate furnishings. These homes might feature glazed windows, a luxury in medieval times, ornate wooden furniture, rich tapestries, and private libraries. The moderately prosperous occupied smaller houses with separate living and working spaces, while the poor crowded into single rooms or cellars with minimal furnishings and no privacy. The governance of medieval cities was a complex matter that involved negotiations between royal authority, noble privileges, church interests, and the emerging political power of wealthy merchants and craftsmen. Many cities had received charters from kings or nobles that granted them specific rights of self-government in exchange for tax payments or military service. These charters typically allowed cities to elect their own officials, maintain their own courts, and regulate trade and manufacturing within their boundaries. Urban government was usually dominated by the wealthiest merchants and master craftsmen, who had the economic resources necessary for political participation and the most to gain from favorable policies. Guild leaders often served as city councilors or mayors, using their positions to advance the interests of their trades and their social class. This created tensions with less wealthy residents who had little voice in city government but were. The legal system in medieval cities was more complex than in rural areas, reflecting the diversity of relationships and conflicts that arose in urban environments. Cities typically maintained their own courts to handle disputes between residents, regulate trade practices, and punish crimes. Guild courts handled internal disputes among craftsmen and enforced quality standards. Church courts dealt with moral offenses and family matters. Royal or noble courts might intervene in cases involving serious crimes or conflicts between different jurisdictions. Crime in medieval cities was a significant problem, reflecting both the greater opportunities for theft and fraud in commercial environments and the social tensions created by wealth inequality and crowded living conditions. Cities employed watchmen to patrol streets and markets, maintained prisons for criminals awaiting trial, and sometimes organized militias to maintain order during periods of civil unrest. Punishment for crimes was often harsh and public, designed to deter others and reinforce social order. Despite these challenges, urban life in 1400 France offered opportunities for personal advancement, cultural enrichment, and social mobility that were largely absent in rural areas. Cities were centers of innovation where new ideas, techniques, and technologies developed and spread throughout society. They were meeting places where people from different regions and backgrounds exchanged information, goods, and cultural practices. There were laboratories of social organization where new forms of government, law, and economic organization were tested and refined. The power of the church, religion, and daily life. The Catholic Church in 1400 France was far more than a religious institution. It was a dominant force that shaped every aspect of medieval life, from the most intimate personal decisions to the grandest political strategies. Its influence permeated daily routines, seasonal celebrations, social hierarchies, economic relationships, and intellectual development in ways that are difficult for modern secular minds to fully comprehend. The medieval worldview was fundamentally religious, based on the belief that earthly life was merely a brief preparation for eternal existence in heaven or hell. This perspective colored every aspect of human experience, making religious observance not just a social custom but a matter of ultimate significance. The Church taught that every human action had spiritual consequences, that divine providence governed all events, and that the salvation of souls was the most important goal of human existence. The physical presence of the church was impossible to ignore in medieval French communities. Every village had its parish church, often the largest and most impressive building in the settlement. Towns and cities featured multiple churches, monasteries, and religious houses, while the great cathedrals that dominated urban skylines represented some of the most ambitious architectural projects in human history. The sound of church bells marked the hours of the day, called people to worship, and announced important events, creating a soundtrack of religious observance that accompanied all daily activities. The parish church was the center of community life in medieval France. Here people gathered not only for religious services but also for community meetings, social events, and sometimes even commercial activities. The church building itself served multiple functions: as a place of worship, a refuge during times of danger, a storehouse for community grain reserves, and a symbol of local identity. The parish priest was one of the most important figures in medieval community life. Unlike the higher clergy who might come from noble families and possess extensive education, parish priests were often recruited from the local population and shared the background and concerns of their parishioners. They were responsible for conducting daily masses, administering sacraments, providing religious instruction, and serving as intermediaries between their communities and higher church authorities. The quality of parish priests varied enormously. Some were learned men who provided excellent spiritual guidance and served as teachers, healers, and counselors for their communities. Others were barely literate, poorly trained, and more concerned with their own material welfare than with their pastoral duties. The church recognized these problems and periodically attempted reforms, but the challenge of maintaining standards across thousands of rural parishes remained formidable. The sacramental system formed the backbone of medieval religious life, providing a framework for understanding and sanctifying all major life events. Baptism, typically performed within days of birth, brought infants into the Christian community and was believed necessary for salvation. Confirmation, usually administered during adolescence, marked the transition to adult membership in the church. Marriage was both a social contract and a religious sacrament that created spiritual as well as legal bonds between spouses. The Eucharist was the central act of medieval Christian worship, believed to transform bread and wine into the actual body and blood of Christ through the miracle of transubstantiation. This doctrine, formally defined by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, made attendance at Mass a profound spiritual experience that connected worshippers directly with the divine. The elevation of the host during Mass was a moment of intense devotion, and some laypeople traveled from church to church. Confession provided a regular mechanism for spiritual cleansing and moral guidance. Medieval Christians were required to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year, usually during the Lent period before Easter. This sacrament served multiple functions. It provided spiritual absolution for the penitent, gave priests detailed knowledge of their parishioners' lives and concerns, and reinforced church teachings about moral behavior through the assignment of penances. Extreme unction, administered to the dying, provided spiritual comfort during life's final crisis and was believed to prepare the soul for judgment. Ordination created the priesthood and established the church hierarchy that governed medieval religious life. These sacraments created a rhythm of religious observance that marked every stage of human development and provided meaning for life's most significant moments. The monastic movement represented the spiritual elite of medieval Christianity, communities of men and women who dedicated their lives entirely to religious devotion. The great monasteries of medieval France, places like Cluny, Citeaux, and Saint Denis, were centers of learning, artistic creation, and economic power that rivaled the greatest noble courts in their influence and sophistication. Monastic life was governed by detailed rules that regulated every aspect of daily existence. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed most French monasteries, divided the monks' day into periods of prayer, work, study, and rest according to a schedule that changed with the seasons but always emphasized the primacy of divine worship. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, marked the progression of each day with communal prayer and psalm singing. The monastery was conceived as a self-sufficient community that could provide for all its members' needs while maintaining separation from the corrupting influences of secular society. Monastic communities typically included workshops for various crafts, libraries for the preservation and copying of manuscripts, infirmaries for the care of sick and elderly monks, guest houses for visitors, and extensive agricultural lands worked by the monks themselves or by peasant tenants. Monastic libraries were among the most important centers of learning in medieval Europe, preserving not only religious texts but also classical works of literature, philosophy, and science that might otherwise have been lost. Monks served as scribes, copying manuscripts by hand in scriptoriums where silence was maintained to aid concentration and reverence. The beautiful illuminated manuscripts produced in monastic scriptoriums represent some of the highest achievements of medieval art, combining religious devotion with sophisticated artistic technique. The economic power of monasteries was enormous. Great abbeys like Cluny controlled vast estates, collected tithes and donations from thousands of supporters, and operated commercial enterprises like mills, breweries, and workshops. The Abbey of Saint Denis, which served as the burial place of French kings, was one of the wealthiest institutions in France, owning land throughout the kingdom and serving as a royal treasury and archive. Pilgrimages were a crucial aspect of medieval religious life, providing opportunities for spiritual devotion, adventure, and cultural exchange. The great pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed medieval Europe brought together people from all social classes and many different regions, creating international communities of faith that transcended political boundaries. The most popular pilgrimage destinations included Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela, but France also had numerous local pilgrimage sites associated. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain was particularly important for French Christians. The route through France, marked by a network of churches, monasteries, and hostels, became a highway of cultural exchange that spread ideas, artistic styles, and commercial practices throughout medieval Europe. Pilgrims carried letters, transported goods, shared news from distant places, and created connections between communities that might otherwise have remained isolated. Pilgrimage served multiple functions in medieval society. For individuals, it provided opportunities for spiritual growth, penance for sins, and sometimes miraculous healing. For communities, it brought economic benefits through the spending of pilgrims and enhanced local prestige if the community possessed important relics or religious sites. For the church as a whole, pilgrimages reinforced the unity of Christendom and demonstrated the power of faith to motivate extraordinary human efforts. The cult of saints was central to medieval popular religion, providing accessible intermediaries between ordinary people and the distant, awesome figure of God. Every church was dedicated to a particular saint, every craft guild had its patron saint, and every individual bore the name of a saint who served as a personal protector and advocate. Saints were believed to possess special power to intercede with God on behalf of their devotees, and their relics, physical remains or objects associated with their lives, were considered to possess miraculous healing properties. The veneration of relics was one of the most characteristic features of medieval Christianity. Churches competed to acquire the most impressive relics, which attracted pilgrims and their donations while enhancing the spiritual prestige of the community. The Abbey of Saint Denis claimed to possess the relics of the patron saint of France, while Sainte-Chapelle in Paris housed what was believed to be Christ's crown of thorns. These relics were displayed in elaborate reliquaries made of gold and precious stones, creating some of the most magnificent works of medieval art. The liturgical calendar provided the basic rhythm of medieval life, organizing time around the celebration of religious festivals and the observance of fasting periods. The church year began with Advent, the season of preparation for Christmas, and progressed through the major festivals of the Incarnation, Passion, and Resurrection. Each season had its own character, colors, music, and ritual observances that created a rich tapestry of religious experience. Christmas was one of the most important celebrations of the medieval year, commemorating the incarnation of Christ and providing a season of joy and feasting during the darkest months of winter. The celebration extended from Christmas Eve through Epiphany on January 6th, creating a period of reduced work and increased social activity. Churches were decorated with greenery and candles, special foods were prepared, and gifts were exchanged among family members and friends. Easter was the supreme Christian festival, celebrating Christ's resurrection and the promise of eternal life for all believers. The approach to Easter was marked by the solemn season of Lent, a 40-day period of fasting, prayer, and penance that began on Ash Wednesday. During Lent, Christians were expected to abstain from meat, dairy products, and other luxuries while increasing their prayers and charitable activities. The Easter celebration itself was a time of great joy, Fia. The numerous saints' days scattered throughout the year provided additional occasions for religious observance and community celebration. Some saints' days were universal, celebrated throughout Christendom, while others were local observances that reflected regional traditions and interests. These festivals often combined religious devotion with secular entertainment, featuring processions, markets, games, and theatrical performances that brought entire communities together. The Church's influence extended far beyond formal religious observances to encompass moral teaching, social welfare, and intellectual development. Medieval Christianity provided a comprehensive worldview that explained the origin and purpose of human existence, established standards for ethical behavior, and offered hope for eternal happiness. Church teachings shaped attitudes toward marriage and sexuality, work and leisure, wealth and poverty, war and peace, and virtually every other aspect of human experience. Marriage was considered both a social contract and a religious sacrament, subject to church law as well as civil authority. The Church established rules about who could marry whom, how marriages should be conducted, and what constituted valid grounds for separation. While arranged marriages remained common, especially among the wealthy, Church teaching emphasized the importance of mutual consent between spouses and gradually developed the idea that marriage should be based on affection as well as practical considerations. The Church's attitude toward sexuality was complex and sometimes contradictory. While celebrating the holiness of marriage and the importance of procreation, Church teaching also emphasized the superiority of celibacy and viewed sexual desire as a dangerous force that needed to be carefully controlled. This created tensions that influenced everything from literary themes to architectural symbolism to personal psychology. Economic life was also shaped by religious teaching. The Church condemned usury, lending money at interest, as sinful, though this prohibition was gradually relaxed as commercial activity became more complex. Religious teachings about charity and social responsibility influenced the development of hospitals, orphanages, and other welfare institutions. The concept of just price attempted to reconcile commercial profit with moral obligation, while religious festivals and holy days provided regular breaks from labor that served both spiritual and practical purposes. Intellectual life in medieval France was dominated by religious concerns and conducted primarily within religious institutions. The University of Paris, founded in the early 13th century, was essentially a corporation of clerics devoted to the study of theology, philosophy, and other subjects deemed necessary for church leadership. Scholastic philosophy, which dominated medieval intellectual life, attempted to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian revelation through careful analysis and logical argument. The great cathedral schools and monastic libraries served as centers of learning that preserved and transmitted not only religious knowledge but also classical literature, historical chronicles, and practical treatises on subjects like agriculture, medicine, and law. Medieval scholars developed new techniques for copying and organizing manuscripts, created comprehensive theological and philosophical systems, and produced works of literature and art that continued to influence European culture for centuries. The church also played a crucial role in social welfare, operating hospitals, orphanages, and hostels that provided care for the sick, poor, and travelers. Monastic communities served as refuges for those fleeing violence or persecution, while parish churches provided centers for community organization and mutual support. Religious teaching about charity and social responsibility created networks of support that helped individuals and families survive times of crisis. Yet the medieval church was not without its problems and contradictions. The wealth and political power of high church officials often conflicted with ideals of apostolic poverty and spiritual humility. The involvement of clergy in secular politics created scandals and compromised the church's moral authority. The complexity of canon law and theological doctrine sometimes made religious observance seem more like legal compliance than spiritual devotion. By 1400, these tensions were beginning to create serious challenges to traditional church authority. Reformers like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia were questioning papal authority and calling for return to simpler forms of Christianity. The Great Western Schism, which divided the papacy between Rome and Avignon from 1378 to 1417, undermined the Church's claims to unity and infallibility. Popular religious movements were developing that emphasized personal devotion over institutional authority. Despite these challenges, the Church remained the dominant cultural force in medieval French society. Its teachings provided the framework within which most people understood their lives and their world. Its institutions offered opportunities for education, career advancement, and social service that were available nowhere else. Its festivals and observances created the rhythms that governed daily life and seasonal celebrations. Its art and architecture created some of the most magnificent expressions of human creativity and spiritual aspiration. Food, feast, and famine, medieval French cuisine. The relationship between food and survival in 1400 France was direct and often precarious in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. For the vast majority of the population, securing adequate nutrition was a constant struggle that shaped daily routines, seasonal planning, social relationships, and even religious observances. Yet within the constraints imposed by technology, climate, and social hierarchy, medieval French cuisine developed distinctive characteristics that would influence culinary traditions for centuries to come. The foundation of the medieval French diet was grain, particularly wheat, rye, and barley, which were consumed primarily in the form of bread. Bread was not merely one food among many but the fundamental basis of nutrition for all social classes, though the quality and type varied dramatically according to wealth and status. The poor ate dark, coarse bread made from rye, barley, or even oats, often mixed with beans, peas, or other fillers that stretched the grain supply but created heavy, difficult-to-digest loaves. The wealthy enjoyed white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, a luxury that required considerable processing and expense. The production of bread was a complex process that involved multiple stages and often entire communities. Grain had to be ground into flour at mills that were typically owned by lords and operated by millers who charged fees for their services. The flour then had to be mixed with water, yeast, and sometimes other ingredients to create dough, which was shaped into loaves and baked in ovens that were often communal facilities shared by entire neighborhoods. In many communities, individual households were not allowed to operate their own ovens, both because of fire danger and because oven rights were a valuable source of revenue for lords or town governments. Instead, people brought their prepared dough to commercial bakers or communal ovens, paying fees for the baking service and sometimes waiting in long lines during busy periods. This system created opportunities for social interaction and community cooperation, but it also made bread production vulnerable to disruption during times of crisis. Beyond bread, the medieval French diet was heavily dependent on porridge, gruel, and other preparations that stretched grain supplies and provided filling, if monotonous, meals. These dishes were typically cooked in large pots over open fires, with ingredients added according to availability and season. A typical peasant meal might consist of a thick porridge made from oats or barley, flavored with whatever vegetables, herbs, or scraps of meat were available. Meat consumption varied dramatically by social class and represented one of the clearest markers of wealth and status in medieval society. Nobles and wealthy merchants consumed meat regularly, often multiple times per day, featuring elaborate preparations of beef, pork, lamb, venison, and various types of fowl. The great feasts of the aristocracy featured spectacular displays of culinary artistry that included whole roasted animals, complex sauces, and exotic preparations that demonstrated both wealth and sophistication. For peasants and urban workers, meat was a rare luxury typically reserved for special occasions like marriages, religious festivals, or successful harvests. A peasant family might slaughter a pig in the fall, preserving most of the meat through salting, smoking, or other preservation techniques to provide protein throughout the winter months. Chickens were valued more for their eggs than their meat, while cattle were too valuable as draft animals to be. The types of meat consumed also varied by region and availability. Coastal areas had access to fresh fish and seafood, while inland regions relied more heavily on river fish and preserved fish imported from coastal areas. Hunting provided some meat for rural populations, though hunting rights were strictly controlled by nobles and poaching was severely punished. Wild game like deer, boar, and various birds were primarily reserved for the tables of the wealthy. Fish played a crucial role in the medieval French diet, not only as a source of protein but also as the primary alternative to meat during the numerous fast days prescribed by the Catholic Church. Medieval Christians were required to abstain from meat on Fridays, during the 40 days of Lent, and on various other holy days that comprised nearly one-third of the year. During these periods, fish became essential for maintaining adequate nutrition, creating a sophisticated fish trade that connected coastal fishing communities with inland markets. The preservation of fish was a major industry in medieval France, employing thousands of people in techniques like salting, smoking, and drying that allowed fish to be transported over long distances and stored for extended periods. Herring from the North Sea, cod from the Atlantic, and salmon from French rivers were preserved and distributed throughout the kingdom, creating some of the first truly national food markets. Dairy products provided another important source of protein and fat in the medieval diet, though their availability was limited by the absence of refrigeration and the seasonal nature of milk production. Fresh milk spoiled quickly and was typically consumed immediately or processed into cheese, butter, or other preserved forms. Cheesemaking was a complex art that allowed dairy products to be stored for months or even years, creating valuable trade goods and dietary staples. The types of cheese produced varied by region, with each area developing distinctive varieties based on local conditions, traditions, and techniques. Some regions became famous for particular types of cheese that were traded throughout France and even exported to other countries. The production of cheese was often a communal activity that brought neighbors together and required considerable skill and experience to execute successfully. Vegetables played a supporting but important role in the medieval French diet, though the variety available was limited compared to modern standards. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots could be stored through winter and provided essential vitamins and minerals during the lean months when fresh food was scarce. Cabbage was particularly important because it could be fermented into sauerkraut, creating a preserved vegetable that remained nutritious throughout winter. Legumes like beans, peas, and lentils were crucial sources of protein, especially for those who rarely ate meat. These crops had the additional advantage of improving soil fertility through their ability to fix nitrogen, making them valuable components of medieval agricultural systems. Dried beans and peas could be stored for long periods and provided the basis for hearty stews and porridges that sustained working families through difficult times. Kitchen gardens attached to peasant houses and urban dwellings provided fresh vegetables during growing seasons and herbs for both culinary and medicinal purposes. These gardens were typically tended by women and represented their specialized knowledge of plant cultivation, food preparation, and household management. The herbs grown in these gardens served multiple purposes, flavoring food, treating illness, and sometimes providing dye for clothing.